Actually found League's next world champion, but it's definitely not Casey Rolster. But okay. I don't know if it sounded like you were trying to imply that there. Like
no, I'm just being a creeper because they won.
But yes, as we will get to in this show, for the second time in history, Katie Rolster has defeated the old enemy. What a glorious day, right? But we'll get to that soon. So, because the thing is, since on the last episode, when I was checking up, obviously we hadn't done any of the playoffs when we had the episode with Kelsey. And the first round, they call it wild card, which is just the best of three, was between SK Telecom, who obviously, if you remember, had just made it into the playoffs, and KSV, who are the reigning world champions, but obviously have their own weird storyline element, which is not only have they never won LCK, they never even made the final. It's actually quite crazy when you consider they've come close to winning 2 world's titles. So, okay, in this matchup, right, we won't devote the whole episode to it. Obviously, most of it's going to be about KT versus SK Telecom, which was the highly anticipated match, and then afterwards, we want to know about the winner of that match versus Afrika. So let's just do a bit on this match, though. When SKT wins this game, and admittedly, both teams won matches in this, obviously, did it actually look like a good game overall? Like, did both teams come with a decent performance?
I would say no. I mean, I think SKT showed that they had a good understanding of how they wanted to play against KSV. They had the Trundle pick for Blink, which ended up working out really well. Bang locked in Kaisa in the first game, which is particularly interesting to me because of what then happened in their KT series. But I think that the games were still really shaky between both teams. Also, SKT really should have won game 2. They kind of threw at Baron. And so I know a lot of the reaction to the series was like, imagine if you tell someone who's never seen Korea for the first time that this is the World Championship final rematch.
Yes.
And it just was not, it's not a good look for either team, to be quite honest. But even, I mean, so going into this KT series, sure, you have a lot of history of KT losing to SKT, etc. But you look at how SKT actually performed in this match, and you're like, KT should win, because this was not a defining, strong performance from SKT, despite the fact that I do think I think their drafts showed kind of what they want to do. They did forego the early game, basically, to kind of scale up and do what they like to do mid to late, which is kind of what SKT also did against KT. That's what they have committed to do, especially ever since they have continued to start blank. So, yeah, it was, I mean, it wasn't a good look for either team, in my opinion.
So obviously, as you say, in game 1, which most of the kills in that game went on to Bang, he had this Kai'Sa pick, which is not a champion, obviously, since it's brand new that we've seen, really. How would you explain what people should expect if they see that and how it's going to be used? Like, is it going to be primarily AD carry?
I would say so, yeah. I would also, she's really strong on this patch, which is why you actually saw SKT Bandit, which is interesting because it means they don't actually want to, they didn't actually want to first pick it against KT, right? Because KT stuck to, spoilers, they stuck to the same ban rotation first round every single game. They had a very definitive idea of what they wanted to do with that first ban rotation, and we'll get into that later. But basically, the end result is that this pick for Bang, it seems like it's something they felt that they could try out against KSV. And I'm only making that assumption actually now based on what they did later against KT, because either they thought, well, Ruler is not a good Kaisa player for whatever reason, so they weren't expecting him to pick it, or they, because KSV then banned it. But I thought Bang played it all right. She is a bit, sieging is she doesn't have like the long range siege like a Caitlyn. And I actually think if KSV had played around how Caitlyn works in terms of sieging turrets, KSV's bot lane did not look good in this series at all. I felt like they didn't really know how to play around the Caitlyn. They didn't really know where to put her for sieging turrets, and they didn't get those pushes bot lane that you'd really want to see from a Caitlyn lane. So that also contributed to the fact that once Bang got his items in this first game, he was just able to stomp in team fights, and she's very, very strong in team fights.
Didn't KSV actually do a decent job in the draft? I mean, these look like pretty champions for them and pretty decent comps, right?
It's all execution. Outside of like, still you see them kind of looking for champions for Crown. He played the Zillion in game 2, which wasn't.
Yeah.
I'd say it's less than ideal, especially if you're looking at the rest of their comp. Typically, if you are playing a Zillion and you're trying to get like a Zillion comp, you want to have some sort of dive, because you're going to be like, when I think of a Zillion composition or a composition with a Zillion in it that works, it's a diving composition where you're going to be attacking turrets kind of with the team. And that's not really what you want to do with Caitlyn and Rise composition here. But I think that in general, their drafts actually weren't that bad. And their Caitlyn priority made sense if they'd actually known how to, or like been able to execute on the win conditions with the Caitlyn. Because I don't think, it definitely wasn't Ruler's best showing in those first 2 games. And then I don't think the team played around it very well either.
Okay, we also had one of these scenarios, which I always try to reference these things in the past shows, you'll notice, when people were bringing in subs, but only for particular games. Because in Korean League of Legends especially, one of the reasons they like to have people at least in some sense active within the rotation, as it were, is to potentially give someone a surprise pick. And so we did see, for actually a good stretch of the split, SK Telecom had gone back to using Antara again, and towards the end of the split, they went back to using Tal. They brought in this rookie again, they put him back in there, and obviously now it seems like he's just the top laner of SK Telecom again. So it seems like this is a series he did pretty well in. Obviously, Cuvée is someone who's hailed as one of the best top laners in the world. What were the issues in that respect, do you think?
I still think Tal, I know this is going to be kind of a weird thing to say based on this series. I still think Tal has a few laning issues that we saw crop up in the KT series.
It's noticeable that they banned Camille every single game just so that Cuvée couldn't take it.
Yeah. And also Tal, the one thing that SKT did really, like, again, I think SKT's drafting was good in this series, like I said, but the pocket Cassiopeia top is something that Tal has practiced, so it's definitely something that they prepped for as a team. And with Faker on the Galio all 3 games, it allows him to pretty much be anywhere and everywhere, and that partners really well with Tal on the more, basically like you're having all that damage come from Tal's top Cassiopeia, and it's obviously something they prep. It's something I know he's spammed in solo queue because it was not a surprise to anyone. So I'm kind of curious as to why KSV either didn't scout that, or it seemed like it did catch them a little bit off guard, despite the fact that it's kind of, I feel like with drafting stuff like this, if I know about it from the US, I feel like it's probably something that's not particularly a secret, I guess. So, but yeah, I think they either want to get him on scaling hyper carries like the Gangplank, which we saw again, or the top lane Cassiopeia. It's weird because they don't always pick for lane for him, but they have tried in the past and it's worked okay. I think the reason why they might have been trying him out over Antara, like aside from scrims, because obviously if you ask them, they're just going to say scrims. But I do think they probably feel like they already know what they're going to get from Antara. Like you're not going to see a tremendous improvement from him probably. Yeah. But if you have this this kid who's a little bit younger, a little bit less experienced, hasn't been with the team as long. Maybe you think he has a little bit more potential.
Like for me as well, surely there's a component where it's like if you've just decided for whatever reason, right, we're going back to blank, and if you go to blank, you're obviously not thinking like we've got the best jungler in the world here. It's sort of like this is a stopgap, like we're just going to make do with what blank can give us, because really, because of the problems they had with Blossom, they just decided like this is too risky, so we'll go with what we think is safe with blank. But as a result, as we saw earlier in the split, you've got to have some carry threats across the map. You can't just have Faker, can you? So in this scenario, you've got to. It makes kind of sense to gamble on Tal, right? Instead of having Ontara and blank, that's kind of like you've resigned yourself to not very good chance of winning the game if you pick both, right?
Yeah, and again, like SKT aren't known for drafting their pushing lanes a lot of the time, which again we'll get into in the second series especially. But for Tal, they have really focused on trying to get him some of those laning counter picks if he's not on like a gangplank, like again, like scaling hyper carry late game where SKT really wants to be anyway. They have kind of focused on getting him laning counter picks to either, you could argue to cover up his laning weaknesses, but you could also argue because they want to play around getting him ahead, because once he's ahead, some of his better EUCS games that people remember are just when he would get on Jason, he would get ahead, and then he'd be able to snowball his advantages that way. So perhaps that's kind of what they're looking for from him as well.
Okay, right. Before we move on to the SK Telecom KT series, right, just give us kind of like final thoughts on KSV for the split now. Now that we know that this is the end for this split, this was the last match. I mean, when you look at it, like in history, going out to SK Telecom, no problem. But you look for this split, that's pretty underwhelming, actually. Like, they would have hoped to at least go out to KT, maybe even have a chance, as you were saying in some of the past episodes, to maybe match up with KT, maybe have a shot at like third place, which, when you look at the split overall, would have been pretty respectable if they could have clawed their way back to there after the, they were another team that was in free fall around that like middle point of the split. So adding this match to the split, what's kind of your conclusions for KSV?
They still really struggle with not having mid priority. I think for me, like, I know I keep harping on this, and I'm going to keep harping on it again when we talk about other teams, but it's especially apparent with KSV, just because if you look at the games they won, it's when they found a really strong pick for Crown to either affect side lanes, like with Talia, for example, or something like Vel'Koz, where he would just sit in mid. And once teams started banning those champions, you notice SKT banned Karma, they banned Vel'Koz, and in Game 3, they banned Zillion, actually. So they were just and
they even had a game where they banned Talia as well.
Yeah,
they obviously were not going to allow that champion pull through, right? Yeah,
they're just kind of like, you know what, we don't want you to have these picks for Crown, because we know that if we can destabilize your mid lane enough, despite the fact that the rest of the team might be team fighting well or whatever, we can still get ahead and kind of slowly push you out of the game.
Should KSV have tried something like just accept that this could happen and try, for example, making like QV a top lane carry or something and just run the game through him or run the game through the bot lane? Should they have gone with a more extreme approach instead of trying to... Because I notice it is sort of a Korean mentality thing where they almost do play like it's the champions, not the players who are playing them. They do think, this is the correct way to play. So, at the moment we're supposed to play through mid, it's like, that doesn't really make sense in this particular team lineup, though.
So, one thing that really bothered me, I guess, about KSV's execution was, again, like I pointed to, they had this Caitlyn, and these compositions with the Caitlyn, like, you push down towers and then you rotate her elsewhere, right? That's the whole point of Caitlyn, is you're just pushing the entire time. You're sieging. You have an incredible siege. And it's not a matter of their drafting here, but it's a matter of their execution. Like, why didn't they play around that lane more? Or what is going on with Ruler and Core JJ that they ended up struggling in those lanes a bit more than I would have thought, given the champion matchup.
Yes.
So that's something also that I think KSV needs to look at when they return to the drawing board. So it's not just mid priority, but it's also like how they're playing around the champions that they have.
Okay, so then let's go to the next series then. SK Telecom versus KT, obviously a classic matchup that we've seen through many different eras, many different players have been involved in it. And for KT, not the exact same lineup, because obviously they have Ucal in the mix now, but similar lineup to obviously last year. And then SK Telecom, obviously bringing in Blank, actually, it becomes more like last year's lineup, but still doesn't feel like the SKT of old, because obviously they have Tal there, and they're in this weird situation where they had tried different junglers out. Right, so I've got to start at the top here, which is this. I do notice that the history of this matchup means that even though, for example, I was actually pretty certain KT would win this matchup. I think KT's a much better team than SK Telecom. And I even told Papa Smithy yesterday on Twitter when he was like, watch this matchup. I was like, the end of SK Telecom. Like, they're not going to win this, mate. But I noticed everyone else was sort of like nervous to even say that, because in their minds, they think to themselves, well, it doesn't matter if KT Rolster, if Rox Tigers are better than SK Telecom, somehow they tend to play worse against them, and then SK Telecom has some heroic game that comes through. Now, obviously that didn't happen, but were you concerned for that coming into this matchup? Like, did you actually think SK Telecom had a shot to win the match?
The thing that always concerns me about KT, and you kind of saw it a little bit in game one, when they played Rush and then didn't really play to kind of having that like early to mid game focus. So once SKT got a team fight that they wanted, once KT kind of awkwardly positioned and overextended, SKT are, and the way they've been drafting as well, and the way they drafted throughout the series, they're really good at coming online mid to late and then snowballing from there. So they'll basically, I'm not going to say they'll purposefully sack their early game, because I don't think it's that. But I do think if they are able to get off those team fights in the mid game, once they have the lead, they typically know how to close a game. That one Baron throw against KSV aside. So against KT, that's actually a good way to play, because KT overextend a lot. Even when they have a lead, they'll think that they can push something somewhere where they maybe shouldn't. And we did still see that in some of these games. But in terms of like the two teams and the way they've been playing going into this, like, so that matchup, the pushing too far ahead where SKT can come in and punish your mistakes, that's in SKT's favor. But everything else is in KT's favor, especially from the way they play the early game. Because again, I think a lot of people have been kind of sleeping on KT's early game this past split, just because it hasn't been as visually explosive maybe as some of their games last year, when they were just kind of like completely stomping people in the first 20 minutes and then maybe fumbling, but then they were so far ahead that they'd close the game out anyway. But KT have a very strong early game focus, and they, in that respect, they're a strong matchup, because SKT do not draft winning lanes a lot of the time. And it's actually really frustrating to watch them do that over and over. I dislike when teams do that.
Would you theory craft something along the lines of, like, presumably in scrims they've tried all sorts of things, right? And maybe they just cannot get it to work when they try having these winning lanes. Or do you think, as another alternative, doesn't have to be this one either, it's obviously going to be a third or fourth option, but another one that I know people will often bring up is just historically, the SK Telecom teams in the last 2 years, for example, were amazing at this style, where the whole point of why they didn't need to have strong early game is if they did badly in the early game, they were so good at finding a way back into a game or staying in a game. And so they were actually the team where it was logical why they draft for late, because that almost ensures they have a chance to win at all points of the game. So do you think there's some of that where this is just how Coma thinks League of Legends is played? Where would you come down on this one?
I think it's a combination of the two, but I do think it is really good to point out that what has SKT learned from the past 2 to 3 years, right? They've learned that they can do this and still win. They've learned that they can do it and still win world championships. They've learned that they can do this and still get to the world's finals last year, when arguably, like, after they lost, because there's this whole like SKT mystique, including like myself, I'm also culpable of this. Like, they always find a way to win, right? Yes. So if you actually take a look at just how those teams are performing, you say, of course, SKT is not going to win the championship if they're playing like this. But then you start thinking of, what they've done in the past and the fact that they still have the best player in the world on their team. And so now you then are like, okay, well, they always manage to pull it out. And they've been taught historically that they can do this. They can wait and scale and get mid-game team fights and then all of a sudden snowball the game from there instead of snowballing early. I do think that to some extent, if it is Coma, if it is the coaching staff, if that's just the way Faker wants to play, you kind of have to look at who's been around with this team for that long, right? So why have they played this way for so long? And yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I think they haven't been punished enough historically that they would change the way they've been playing. Because why would you change if you're still winning world championships, right?
There's definite logic to it. But that's actually what obviously makes this particularly pertinent is if anything's going to be a wake-up call, surely the combination of this split and then where you've now failed and who you've lost to, this all together should kind of be like, it should kind of tell SK Telecom, right? These lineups aren't really working and something has to change going forwards, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a question then. I guess we'll do that at the end, like we did with the KSV one. We'll do like an SK Telecom summary. So I shouldn't have asked you that at the top. Actually, let me ask you this then. So when they played, KT Rolster played Rush in that last game against a free kill, which was the end of the split. It was already decided who was second and third anyway. The games didn't matter, although obviously they're going to match up in the next particular round of the playoffs. When they played Rush there, it was really hard to tell if that was just like, here's a throwaway game, mate, you can have a game, or this is fan service, we know the fans want to see a very popular player, put him on a carry champ, give him a chance to go off, But I did say, actually, if you remember on that episode with Kelsey, I also do wonder if after seeing it working, they'll think, right, this is something we can do in the playoffs. Now, personally, I would have thought it would be more along the lines of, say you lose like the first game in really weird fashion, maybe you throw him in the second one just so, they can't literally adapt to what you did. They have a new challenge to match up with and something to draft against, something to mess it up around that sense. But obviously they went in with him in game one here and they did put him on Olaf and basically it seemingly seems like they wanted to throw something at SK Telecom. SK Telecom probably didn't mostly practice for. Presumably you did practice expecting score. And then if it works, obviously great. It's even harder for SK Telecom. But if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. You bring score in next game. So what did you actually think of the execution of putting Rush in? Was the coherence to him being in the team?
I actually do think putting him in made sense. And again, I kind of ate my words because, I've been like, why would you ever put Rush in? When we talked about it with Kelsey as well, until I actually saw him play. And I think that there is, they can put Rush in now because they have Ucal. And once again, the star of this series for me, outside of score, was Ucal. And the fact that he is such a high pressure player in the mid lane makes such a huge difference if you're going to play a jungler like Rush, because previously I don't think they ever could have played him with Pawn, because Pawn never had the push on the lane and he would fall behind even in matchups where he was supposed to be ahead. So I do think that you see a few things go wrong in this first game around warding. I don't think that Rush and Ucal had their vision rotations set up, and I don't think they were able to unlock Mata like they wanted to roam for vision or roam to gank lanes. There was that time period around I think it was 12 minutes where Rush was suddenly topside and then he was bot side, and so then he started really affecting the lanes. But I think it happened a little too slowly because they didn't have their vision set up, and because SKT actually did get a lot of really strong vision in Rush's jungle and also in the river, and they were able to see where he was, and that kind of shuts down what they really want him to do with the invades. As we saw in the next game, Score did the same thing, but he had the vision and he had the backup, and he completely tracked blank the entire time. In the exact same matchup, Olaf versus the Jarvan.
Yes.
So I think that it makes a lot of sense to play Rush, but they do really have to watch out for their vision, because you can't play that kind of style without having the push in mid with Ucal and without having some sort of vision set up or another pushing lane to where you want to invade or gank. And they were a little bit slow to start that off, and I do think SKT warded around Rush very well.
Right. Usually when people, because it's a famous thing, mostly on Twitter admittedly, where people who are the Twitter analysts always say that whoever's dying loads in a game is inting all the time, right? And they've definitely taken that meme way too far in most cases. But when people blame Blank in this series, he did die an absurd amount of times. And if you watch some of the times he died, like, yes, you do have to put in the context. He is playing against probably the smartest jungler in the world. But even so, I mean, he was contributing a lot to some of these losses, right?
Are you thinking of the Krug death in the last game? Because I think that was like the nail in the coffin for Blank in terms of the way the community was going to see him. Because previously, I think you really do have to look at some of these mid lane matchups, because although Swain is an absolute beast, like it's a really strong champion, he will lose the push to an Azir. And that will affect what the jungler can do. I also do think that KT came in, and if you look at their first 3 bans, like I said, every single ban rotation, use Zac, Trundle, Sejuani. And they were like, okay, Blank, you're not going to play any of the champions that you've done well with this year.
Basically, they did to Blank what SK Telecom just did to Crown.
Yeah. And you saw KT do this with, actually they did it to Ruler last year in the same matchup, I think, in the same round of the playoffs when they played Samsung, or maybe it was a round later, but they basically banned out every single one of Ruler's champions in the first rotation, and he was completely off.
It's actually kind of weird if you think about it that KT doesn't do this more often, because one of the things they have in a strength of having all these star players is they actually have pretty good champion pools across the board. They can actually I mean, you have to have a weak team, admittedly, to make this work, because whatever you give up by doing all these bans, you give other players on their team a chance to do it. But as we've seen in both these instances, SK Telecom with Blank completely eliminated and KSV with Crown eliminated didn't really have a viable option. Like, it's not like giving QV an extra pick was going to win them the whole game and skew it against you. So it's actually a pretty logical way to go, right?
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing in this draft that I do really want to bring up is the Kaisa, because it definitely didn't seem like SKT wanted to sacrifice taking it. And that's particularly interesting. So, like, First of all, Deft is one of the AD carries in Korea that kind of started playing with her first. So I know a lot of people are very terrified of his Kaisa, despite the fact that we haven't really seen much of it outside of solo queue. But I also think it was really telling that they went for Kaisa against KSV, yet did not do that against KT. And that also affected what they wanted to do with pick ban as well throughout this series. They basically said, we can't match KT early, so we're going to do our mid to late game thing. And it worked in game 1 because KT wasn't able to get the early game that they wanted quickly enough. But once score came in, it was not a good look for SKT again. And I think Blank not being on those champions that he is a lot more comfortable with, especially the Zac and the Trundle pick that we saw that they found for him against KSV, it definitely affected his pathing, because Score was able to know where he was pretty much at all times.
This is something that actually was a bit disturbing for me beyond this match as well, because if you think of the future of SK Telecom, right, the fact that KT every time first rotation banned all of Blank's champions, and yet SK Telecom seemingly never even considered bringing in Blossom, tells me they probably didn't practice for Blossom and had no intention of doing it. Because if I'm them, like, let's say game 4 where you're already down at elimination point, that's when, okay, if they're going to ban out all these, cool, I'll just bring in Blossom and have him play Jarvan or something, right? At least give it a go. But apparently that was not even on the table for them, seemingly.
Yeah, it wasn't actually, I believe Papa Smithy said on broadcast that Blossom was not there with them at the studio, and Pawn was also not there for
Right.
KT.
Okay.
So KT fully committed to Ucal. They were like, this is our guy. And I think he has stepped up tremendously. I still think he has stuff to work on, right? Like he still is kind of over aggressive sometimes. Like he has those solo queue tendencies. He could work on some of his wording. But other than that, he has been really strong for KT. And it seems like he really doesn't get nervous in these high pressure situations. And that is amazing. It's like exactly what KT needed, right? Because not that Pawn would get nervous, but his mechanics were falling off and he wasn't able to have mid lane priority. He's had a lot of health issues with his back, which I know have affected his ability to practice and stuff like that. So I think that the fact that KT were like, we're not even going with Pawn at all, we're going to have Ucal this entire game, was very telling. I also think that the fact that SKT did not have Blossom with them there is particularly telling. Because again, despite the fact that it might have meant that SKT don't even make playoffs this split, I actually would have preferred to see them stick to Blossom and have him work out some of those issues, because he's never going to learn. Like, as we've seen
now he has
over
no
and over
playoff
again,
experience. Yeah. So it sucks even more, right?
As we've seen, like with junglers, like even Score and Ambition were allowed to kind of screw up, right?
Yes.
When they were first learning, they didn't look anywhere near what they look like today. Even if you can trace a lot of their tendencies to what they do now, but in terms of their actual play and what they knew of the jungle positions, like night and day. And it just required a lot of experience. And SKT really don't seem committed to giving their junglers a lot of experience outside of what they kind of did with Bengi. But in that way, he was kind of bringing his own experience with him, and then they were swapping between him and Blank. So again, despite the fact that it might have cost them a playoff spot, I am kind of sad that they didn't continue to give Blossom a chance, because after that one Peanut Olaf game, we have not seen him at all. And the fact that he wasn't even with them at the studio is really telling. Despite the fact that I do think Score would have had the upper hand on him.
Okay, right. What would you say, taking into account this playoff series here and general tendencies throughout the split, how would you describe Faker's performance?
I think there are a lot of people who were very critical of Faker in this series specifically, and I think a lot of that really... I
mean, a lot of people still do think that this is like basketball and he can just take the ball and score whenever he wants. Like, it's not. It doesn't really work that way, does it? But within context of this series, did he underperform for your expectations?
I think it's really hard to say because of the jungle mid 2v2 was so heavily in favor of KT. And so in that regard, there was a lot of pressure on Faker from the get-go in the mid lane. And additionally, he had Swain with scaling side lanes. And like I said before, Swain, despite the fact that he's a very strong champion and he has a ton of AoE damage in team fights, which is really what they're looking for, right? They're looking to go late and then just have Swain come in and obliterate people, which is actually what started happening with Ucal Swain, especially in game 4. Like, it wasn't even mid game where he was just coming in and people were automatically dying. But you don't get the push in mid the same way you do with an Azir, with a Talia. And because their jungle 2v2 was already skewed because Score is just constantly tracking Blank, right? They ban out his champions and Score is just all over Blank. He knows exactly where he is. He knows when he can go in and attack Blank. He knows when he can go in and gank lanes because Blank won't be there. It really affects what you can do from the mid lane. And we didn't see Faker on, for example, the Galio, trying to affect the side lanes that way. And again, like a lot of this, so I think Faker was fine. I definitely don't think it was his best performance, but I also think the way that SKT drafted, again, if you're drafting Swain and then you're drafting Tristana, who's going to get pushed in, if you're drafting, what did they have in game 2? It was Gangplank and Tristana. Like Swain, Gangplank, and Tristana, you're just going to get pushed in. Despite the fact that that is like an absolutely insane late game team fight. You're going up against Kalista, you're going up against Smeb, or against Camille. You have Ucal in the mid lane as a Zir who's going to push in, and you have Score invading as Olaf. That entire map is just going to be pushing into you at all times.
That's why it was beautiful that not only was it your old rival you used to beat that you lost to, but they lost to a team that's basically telling you, like, pretty good having all these pushing lanes, right?
I mean, I was just happy to see KT kind of trying to play, because I've harped on them before about, like, drafting some of these pushing lanes and then not playing to them necessarily. And today we really, I mean, you could argue that SKT let them, but they also did play really well around having the push in all 3 lanes at times. And even like in the 3rd game when they had the Renekton, they basically saved the laning counter pick for Tall. And they're like, okay, we're going to put you on Renekton. But then they still had KT still had the mid jungle 2v2, which meant that they couldn't really help Tall up there. And Smeb is on Ornn, so he's just going to sit there and farm and still be super useful later. So it was, I think it was definitely a drafting mismatch, and I think KT drafted really well for what they came in and they were like, this is what SKT want to do, and this is how we're going to attack them right in the jungle, basically so that it takes a lot away from Faker, because if they're so mismatched in the 2v2, there's only so much Faker can do, even if he does eventually get the push in the mid lane, if that makes sense.
To circle back then to the SK equivalent of the KSV one, at the end of this split, okay, yes, also they were in a scenario where maybe when you think of the expectations towards the end, yeah, they probably overcame them by actually winning a playoff series, by finishing in, I mean, this would be 4th place. That's not that terrible, really. But everything combined, isn't this kind of a dire picture for SK Telecom? Where do you see them?
I mean, they can't keep... I know I've said this a lot this split, but like they can't keep doing what they've been doing and just plugging in these players around Faker, Bang. Despite the fact that Faker and Bang are both strong players, they can't keep doing this and expect to be able to win in Korea anymore. Not with teams like Kingzone, and to a lesser extent Afrika, and now KT, who obviously prepared very well for this series. I think they had a very strong game plan going in that attacked all of SKT's weaknesses, especially when SKT just kind of sat back and they were like, yes, we are going to do this. Yes, we are going to draft scaling lanes. Yes, we are going to wait until mid to late. And I really think they need to look at the jungle position. Not to say like...
Sad thing is, they could have had Rush, if you think about it. He would have absolutely joined in the offseason if they wanted him, and he's obviously an aggro player who, you know... Actually, now when you look back, it looks even stupider. They're just stuck with blank.
I mean, they need to get something going in the jungle, because that's really where they're losing, is the jungle mid 2v2. Because a lot of what you look at Faker's mistakes, even when Blossom was playing... It was a lot of like miscommunication, like Faker would push in the wave and Blossom wouldn't be there, or Blossom would be invading and Faker would be backing and one of them would die. And there were those miscommunications there. And then with Blank, it just seemed like in this series, because KT targeted Blank so heavily, there was nothing for Faker to do, because especially when he was on Swain and his 2 side lanes are also losing. He's still getting pushed in by like an Azir, and there's not much he can do. He can't help Blank, he can't get the push in mid, and he can't help his side lanes, and the entire map is just collapsing back in on him. So they really, with how important mid lane priority is, and with how important that jungle mid 2v2 is, they really need to look at their jungle position. Like, I actually think that you could, theoretically, if you really wanted to, keep the Tall and Tara rotation, but you need a stronger jungler. And you need to stick with that jungler. Like, you need to actually commit to having someone in that jungle position. And I thought it was going to be Blossom, despite the fact that I don't think Blossom is super strong, but I think when he was on the team was playing a lot more proactively. And despite the fact that he made a lot of mistakes, he made the mistakes that you would expect of a solo queue jungler, which was like overextending or, trying to push a gank too hard or maybe invading without vision, stuff like that. And I think that's teachable, especially on a team with a lot of veterans like Faker. Like, you still have the best player in the history of the game in your mid lane to help you. And we've seen Faker help junglers in the past. Like, one of the reasons why Blink improved so much in 2016 was because Faker was basically kind of holding his hand while jungling. And it's really frustrating to see them go back to kind of just this style where they bring in whichever like experienced jungler has been sitting on the bench and have them play. They did it with Peanut and Blank when Peanut kind of started to struggle, and then they did it again this year with Blossom and Blank, and then they started with Wolf Jungle for whatever
which
reason,
shows even they knew there wasn't really a perfect solution there. They were just trying stuff out. Right, okay, what about this then? Before we go into the future matchup, which is going to be KT versus Freaka, which, to be fair, I mean, that was on the cards that was going to happen basically the whole split along, unless Kongdi would bizarrely just fallen apart. So, no, not Kongdi, Kingzone, obviously. But in this matchup, okay, for KT, it's so bizarre to me that they didn't play this Ucal guy until partway into the split. And yet it turns out this guy was just sat there on this bench. And I'm not going to go as far as some people just because he had some great games recently and be like, he's the next big thing in fucking Korea. Like, calm down. I mean, he has one half of his games on his ear. So I definitely need to see more before I'm going to like rate him as a star player. But it is kind of crazy that they just had this guy sat on the bench there. And from seeing him in games, he looks better than half the mid laners in the LCK. You think of all these other teams, Rocks Tigers, Jin-Air, they're like a mid laner away from being really good teams, and this guy's just sat on KT's bench. It's kind of ridiculous, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing with Ucal, I wanted to look up his birthday because I wasn't sure when he turned 17. Young? He's 17 now. He just turned 17 in January. So, from the way he's been playing with the team, as far as I know, he's been scrimming with them since the off season or like since the end of last year. But he obviously couldn't play until this split. And my guess is that they did want to start things off with Pawn because, again, like we kind of talked about this with Kelsey, where it's still a lot to say that despite the fact that when they kept this roster, Pawn was obviously the player that everyone looked at and they're kind of like, well, I don't know if he's going to be able to hang on because of his health issues and because of his lack of mid priority. And because even when he was out of lane, he didn't seem like he was syncing up with the team very well. And he didn't seem like he was drawing pressure like he used to. I think they probably still didn't want to miss having another like experienced voice because Pawn is pretty smart when you listen to him like speak outside. I can only speak to like when I've seen him in stream or like with the team. But he has a pretty strong understanding of the game when he's like outside of it and looking from a top-down level. So I think that and his experience and the fact that they probably finally figured out their communication going into the split maybe was one of the reasons why they were reluctant. But once mid priority in the jungle 2v2 became such an important thing, especially after I think double relic shield kind of stopped, because then you have a much more volatile bot lane, so you can gank both side lanes if you want to, and you end up playing them out quite differently than when the season first started. I think that's really when they realized, oh, we need to have a mid laner who can have that push. And I think they could have been worried about how he'd perform, right? Because sometimes you never know if you're going to plop a player on stage and he's just not going to perform as well as he does in scrims, because scrims are completely different. It's a completely different atmosphere. It's a completely different style of play. You go for a lot of things in scrims that you would never do on stage. And I think Ucal has... I was also hesitant because the first time he played, I believe it was against Kongdu, and it was 2 Zir games. And I was just like, okay, like, yeah, he looked really good, but it was against the worst team. And so we really have to really have to sit back and kind of temper our expectations. But I think he has steadily improved in the things that he needs to improve, like team fight flanks and when to gank side lanes on Talia, or when to join up with the team, or when to teleport, where to ward, like all those really small things that go in hand in hand with when to have the mid lane push and how he's communicating with either Score or Rush now. I think all of those kind of, not intangibles because you can still see them, but you kind of have to look for them in the game. I think that's really what he's kind of consistently improved on, despite the fact that he still occasionally does have those like hyper aggressive solo queue, like I can totally go for this, and then maybe dies under the opposing turret, which we actually saw happen once, I believe, last night. So it didn't cost the team much because it was a 1-for-1 trade, I believe, and he still got first blood. But it was that's the kind of thing that if he tempers that a bit more, like he is a remarkably talented player, and he really doesn't seem to be affected by the pressure of being on a historic organization like KT or in the playoffs. And that's actually huge. Like, it's a very underrated thing, and it's something that KT, a team with a history of kind of weird mental issues, I think really also is nice to have for the team, right? Like, you have this rookie who's super eager to play and seems to be very cool under pressure, and that's awesome for KT to have.
So as we go into this next matchup then, I mean, I know they call it like round 3 or whatever, but I just call it the third place game, because if you think of it like the lower bracket of a double elim, basically whoever loses this match is third place. So KT versus Afrika, right? The standings would tell us this should be a great matchup, because obviously Afrika won the first match 2-1, and at the very end of the split 2-0 KT won, so that should hype you up. But the first question has to be, in light of the fact, for the standings, it didn't matter who won that game. It also was a game where, again, both teams knew we might see each other in sort of like 2 weeks from now in the playoffs. And KT did play Rush in one of the games. Do you? Oh yeah, sorry, both. Do you discount kind of that last matchup? Like, is it as close as the record suggests? What's your take?
I think it's going to be close because I actually think KT have improved. Again, because they've, through the back half of the split, I believe their final like 5 series or so, they really committed to having Ucal as their starting mid, right? So they're just like, you know what, we're going to go with this guy, and that's what we're committing to, and that's what we're going to do. And you've seen the team improve, I think, as a unit, because they have had a better sense of mid lane pressure. I think that makes actually a huge difference. I don't want to technically discredit the final match, but again, like, I do see it as almost more of a scrim, because I do think both teams were kind of just like, it's not anything that matters in the standings. And I think that they could have assumed that they would face each other again, because that's the logical conclusion if you looked at the way that KSV and SKT were playing. I think the big thing is going to be because first of all, what jungler Afrika decides to start, because I think Afrika, they've been trying to do a more aggressive style with Mowgli, which works again because Kuro is also a very strong mid laner. And
so do you think that's something they come out with against KT in KT's early strong game? It's a way to kind of combat that?
In my opinion, it's something they should do, or they should at least try it in game 1, despite the fact that I do think Spirit is a smarter jungler. And I think he has his defining play style, right, where he's going to join up with the team, and it lends itself really well to the way Afrika like to skirmish and they like to team fight, right? They want Tucson initiate, like they want Tucson unlocked and initiating. They want Kuro on a champion where he can affect the side lanes and initiate as well. Or even Keen on something like a Rise, for example, where he can come in and affect the mid lane.
So in that case, actually, the whole matchup gets more interesting, because we've got 4 junglers who could just be mixed in depending on what they want to go with, right? There's some mind games even as to who you field, because for all you know, you field Rush and then they're putting in the other guy anyway, right?
Yeah, I'm wondering if we're just going to see like a Rush Mowgli game one
That'd
where
be
like
hype as fuck.
both teams are just trying to invade each other's jungles and get the mid lane pressure. I think the draft is going to look a lot different, obviously, than what they did for SKT, because KT is not going to be able to just ban out a single player. And yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to seeing what both of these teams do in the jungle position. I think at this point, it's safe to say that KT is going to go with Ucal no matter what. So that's, I feel like that's kind of an assumption that people should be operating with at this point, especially since they didn't even bring Pawn to the studio yesterday, according to the casters. So, yeah, I'm really excited for this matchup, because previously in the season, I wouldn't have given KT a chance to win because I think they make too many mistakes. And I think against SKT, we still saw some of those hyperactive tendencies where, like, you know, Smeb's diving in as Camille and the rest of the team, the rest of SKT kind of just collapses on him and he dies, or, you know, Deft gets collapsed on and dies. We still kind of see that tendency for KT to push when they don't really have to. And Afrika will punish that a lot more swiftly than SKT will, and they also will not draft all scaling lanes. So it's going to be, I think it's going to be a really interesting series with a lot more early to mid game focus.
Afrika, who obviously are the higher seed and who actually, as I said, if you take aside the match, that probably doesn't really matter, have been better than KT for most of the split. Are they the favourite to win this matchup?
I'd still put them at the favorite. I think this KT, and I said this previously on the last episode we have with Kelsey, but I think this KT is definitely a summer team, because I think their commitment to Ucal, the fact that they have been kind of flexing Rush in during those game ones and during the game one this past series, and then during the Afrika series to end the split, I think you can see a definite trajectory of improvement where this team is becoming more flexible because they do have a lot more mid lane priority. But I don't think they're quite there yet in terms of making mistakes and sometimes being able to close out the game, especially if their opponents do have somewhat of a scaling like 5v5 comp. And while I don't think Afrika will draft all scaling lanes like SKT, I do think their 5v5 is quite good. When they are able to get the kind of double initiation CC from Kuro and from Tucson. So that's really what I'm looking for. I think Afrika is just a slightly more complete team right now, although I still give the edge to them, although I won't be as shocked, I guess, if KT win. Like, I still put them solidly as like the third place team in my mind right now based on the series from last night.
This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Mikkel Hansen, Andreas Westerlund, Alex Adams, Gman, Twch, Jerky's Minion, Gianfranco Ingrata, Anthony, Bash, Greb, Yordan Tsenkov, Daniel Yordanov. Want to suggest guests or topics for my content? Well, keep it G-rated and unlock the code to the streets, gaining exclusive access via the Patreon link below. The Scrilluminati grows daily.